IamDeepState. How are you, sir?
Great. Good morning. How are you?
Good morning. How was the weekend? All right?
Yeah, okay. Pretty restful.
Okay, so fantastic. So I think, the idea here is to really, for lack of a better kind of expression, do a primer on what the deep state is. As per, of course, your name, I am Deep State. You have a pretty prolific background that intersects not just the public side, but of course also the private and kind of corporate side. So I've worked in government, I've worked in the private sector, you've worked in development economics, you've worked in Wall Street side as well. So I thought we could maybe start with, the deep state to you. How do you think about it if you had to, let's say, explain it to someone who has no real clue? And I think there's a lot of kind of vague feelings and thoughts out there. I, for one, used to think, well, maybe it's just a bunch of 10 rich guys, right, sitting around kind of a desk. But I think that's probably something else. Not to say that doesn't happen. But from your standpoint, having been very much deep in it, still very kind of connected, how would you think about it?
Well, I guess the initial thought of people who use the term deep state now, and a lot of people who use it in media and in social media is that, and the internet, is that they talk about it as if it's some sort of monolith. They exist in an office building, that there is a defined group, just like a company. And then they have functions like marketing and operations. But actually, deep state is a description of a state of mind, a group of affiliated, cohesive, yet also quasi-independent institutions, government institutions, quasi-government institutions, even private sector institutions such as a World Bank Group, which are independent, but very, very closely associated in their function, which is supporting Bretton Woods, even though Bretton Woods as a treaty is formally over as an agreement, but supporting basically the US dollar rules-based driven economy, which has dominated and influenced and guided nations and all its economies since post-World War II. So it's easier to define really what it is. It isn't a star chamber of a dozen elderly, decrepit wise men, or not so wise men who sit and make decisions. It's a collection of institutions which are aligned and share values and share mission. And often those interests aren't shared, but the mission is shared. And if you back up a bit and you look at what is government's main interest, any government, and the people in it, it's survival.
Yeah, control and influence and survival, right?
Yeah. I remember people use quotes like, well, government is the only entity with a legal monopoly on violence.
Yeah.
But let's back that up, because I would say that government really doesn't like to use violence. One thing about diplomats is that they all try to avoid war, because war is very wealth destructive. If you want to really boil down to, of course,
for the majority. Yeah.
Of course, war is destructive, and no one wants to see the loss of human life.
Unless you're the industrial complex. Again, the war drum's on a permanent loop, but yes, net, kind of agree with you, right?
Yeah, as you said, for the industrial complex, that's a benefit, that's an outcome. But
of course, they also need a place of stability, right?
Yes, you need stability to run a company. You need a stability to do what you and I are doing. And governments need stability in order to project power.
So that's why they try and avoid war, and I guess you could say extreme violence as the ultimate kind of last resort. Again, generally speaking.
Yes, generally speaking. And really, whenever all the pundits out there talk about them desiring a Ukraine or a Middle East conflict, that's furthest from the fact, because there are ways deep state keeps you and I as individuals and countries in line without a war. There are ways to keep you in a box without a war and without a military conflict.
Really? So just on that point, is that like themes from, let's say, colonialism and imperialism, which was the classic kind of divide and kind of conquer, right? So you and I take over a region, there's a minority majority, we leave the minority in power. And again, before they can even turn kind of their attention on us, they're focusing on their own kind of domestic kind of issues. I guess you could say maybe the issues in today's modern world, a lot of people kind of take back to how the borders were drawn by the British Empire or previous kind of empires, depending on where you are in the world. Would you say that's also kind of an extension of maybe, the deep state really at work?
It's like if we will drill down on the historical economics of colonialism versus current deep state. I think current and colonialism was a kind of, let's say, deep state 1.0. Okay,
Okay.
just like DOS was to Windows, a very simple but crude operating system. Deep state today is very much different. Post World War II, let's say, period, is very different than your classic colonialism, which we would call in the economics parlance mercantilism. Okay, with mercantilism, it was straight up conquer, strip out a colony key resources,
Extraction at the end of the day, right?
Tea or coal or extraction, right, and leave the colony and its peoples with just enough sustenance to help you extract those resources, use them as cheap labor, prevent disease outbreaks so that your people don't get ill and bring back disease while they're bringing back.
And history book littered with all of this, from slavery in the U.S. to, I think I saw some stats on X that, the British Empire took something like 40 trillion, if you adjust for CPI, out of India over the years that they were there. I mean, just insane kind of amounts of, I guess you could say, raping and pillaging, right?
Yeah, there was a one-way street, okay?
Right.
It was a one-way street, and where it was winner take all, and where it was a zero-sum game. Now, post-World War II, the U.S. deep state looked at the world and said, actually, we're the only ones left who are really powerful, and during that 1945 to 1950 period before the bomb, actually, we could colonize the rest of the world. But instead, they took to a more mutually beneficial 2.0 version, which is to say, join our system and you will get credit cards, ATM cards, trade financing, capital to rebuild your infrastructure. And if you play according to our broad rules, we'll allow you to trade with us, and we'll all mutually benefit and all have something to lose, which is what governments try to protect as their GDP increases, which is what happened to global worldwide GDP post-World War II.
So if I understand deep state pre-World War II and then post, the old model was you and I are an empire, right? We basically have to take over our neighbors to be able to dictate terms to them. That was kind of the old school kind of command and conquer. And from me interpreting what you're saying post-World War II, what the U.S. did was basically synthetically expanded their borders with these terms, saying we can play nice, we can have stability, and I'll open up, these benefits if you're on Team USA. And then obviously if you're not, then that's a whole kind of different bag altogether. Is that the correct kind of way of thinking it? Or am I reading it the wrong way?
Yeah, loosely speaking, it is. Join us, and you will have benefit. And if you don't like us and don't join us, you'll simply be isolated and not benefit. And hence, this is what you saw in Soviet Union and China post World War II, right up through the Cold War. And the prime reason I described this to you is the deep state in the U.S. didn't do this for economic reasons as the primary reason. They did this actually for national security reasons, because deep state, the collective institutions, military, intelligence, and economic, kind of lean back and say, although the U.S. are dominant just after World War II, and so obviously dominant, right? They were the only country left with unscathed economic and social landscape. Aside from Pearl Harbor, they didn't get attacked at all. So the big problem for them wasn't the economic one. It was a national security one. Because if you were to try colonize the world based on the old model we described, and to have a direct engagement to fight communism, which, as you will remember, was rampant then. China rising, you have the Soviet Union rising, and a lot of uncertainty as to whether that model would succeed or fail. It wasn't so clear at that time. Even militarily, it wasn't so clear. So the only way really was to enlist the rest of the world, right, in this cause. And the only way to enlist them was to economically incentivize them. And you probably ask, how do I see that angle? Well, as I did economic development in numerous countries, of course, if you go to the World Bank website, its mission globally is the eradication of global poverty. That's a stated mission, poverty alleviation. And certainly that's a noble mission, and certainly that's what a lot we're engaged. But if you step back, especially as I worked in Eastern Europe and Russia, in the 90s, post-collapse, or during their collapse, numerous African countries, and trying to resolve a lot of their infrastructure problems. The whole goal was to bring them into a system such that for national security purposes, they had no incentive to turn against you. It's a more beneficial way and less costly way, as I said, in the military sense that we discussed earlier, much less costly than the colonial models.
Yeah.
And so now the U.S. at that time, post-World War II, with the largest, most effective Navy, Air Force, Army in the world, would say, I don't necessarily have to have bases and to operate colonies all over the world. What I have to do is just with my Navy, patrol the world seas, and we're going to keep all these sea lanes open. There won't be, as in the colonial days, great threats of piracy or being privateered. Having a colonial country seize shipment of diamonds or coal. We're going to keep these seas open. That was relatively easily done for most of that Cold War era, because the U.S. inherited an extremely large navy from World War II and then Korea. I guess, looking back in history, really validated that viewpoint just after World War II, because it showed the kind of threat that was out there, and that the U.S. needed allies. So it's this model that not only benefited developing countries, but certainly benefited the U.S. in wealth creation. And getting back to what diplomats do with this kind of system and influence, especially as the U.S. dollar migrated from being backed by gold to being backed by itself, by mere fiat, you can see that what a tool and model it is for diplomats. Because as I said earlier, now we'll go back to government and survival. They don't have to actually wage wars, colonial or otherwise, to maintain an empire. In fact, the main goal of a diplomat is to achieve your country's interest by lying, cheating, threatening, cajoling, coaxing, anything except war. Because a government's business is not business, it's survival. And that survival is predicated on national security and maintaining your national security interest at all costs. Because without national security, you have no economy. There is no basis for it. There's no basis for your culture, your beliefs, your society.
So in parlance, it's like it's got to be a going concern, right? Like if you have a venture, if you have a startup, right?
You have to keep it going.
And that's, again, priority number one from the government's perspective, right?
Yes, that's the basis. That's the very platform of why you see a Forbes 400 richest. They can't even get there, or approach to get there, if they're in a situation like Sudan, Somalia, where there's what we call civil strife, governments in transition, a government that's ineffective or a broken state, a term which we in that business use. You can barely sustain yourself. You can barely go from day-to-day food.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's just a function of volatility, right? How well can you build if there's a lot of volatility? And the answer is not very well, right? Generally speaking. So if you want generally higher probability in regards to success, innovation, pioneering, you need longer periods of volatility, right? Again, here we're speaking kind of in generalities. It's kind of a bit of a side thought stream I had in regards to, there's a piece I'm putting out on war. It's a bit of a side tangent, but you get what I'm trying to say here. And it's like, just from the mindsets that you and I have, I think the best analogy I've really come across, it's like almost like the house mentats of Dune. You have to run all kinds of calibrations on anything that could happen, positive, negative, small, big. And of course, there's a lot of noise in that and there's a lot of signal, but it's all about optimizing for basically what your long-term objectives are. And the back of me was always like, man, a lot of these terrorist organizations and groups are really kind of underperforming. But then I also realized that they have very different environments in which to be able to execute. There's much more volatility being a terrorist than, let's say, being an FBI or CIA in what you could do, who you can rely on, and what you can kind of tap into. So I think a big part is really vol. But just turning it back on again the deep state, a big understanding of mine is it's also really very much wedded in administration and the operation of governments or big institutions. There's a few examples of people in the US who have famously held very important under the radar roles regardless of what administration is in, which is basically to almost suggest that they are above administrations. I can see the argument of that being negative and that also being positive. What kind of constituents or taxonomy would you, let's say, provide to say who are the people that make up the deep state? Is it wrong to just think of it as like from, let's say, a government and a quasi kind of government entities, whether it's military, let's say the World Bank or the UN? Are there also elements of deep state, let's say, in the private sector or in other areas that maybe people don't really think about? I mean, it's a lot to kind of unpack there, but I was just wondering if we could, go down some of these silos.
Yeah. Unlike private sector, deep state, government institutions are necessary to our day-to-day survival, whether it's collecting your rubbish, making sure water pipes flow to your house. So I never saw myself as when I was working at the World Bank, my title was merely an officer. No, there's no VP, senior VP, there's no partner, there's no family ownership, and it's just like the military. You can go, and the organization will replace you. Yeah. It's like the Matrix in that way. It's like the Borg in that way. It has to survive, because what underpins it is a group of quasi-independent institutions which must survive political change. The joke was, if you talk, having drinks with a lot of government people, is that we often, watching CNN at a bar and the president comes on, we often quietly sneer, well, who cares what he said? He's just the president. Actually, it's your administrative deep state that, in this complex economy we have and financial system, that keeps it running. I know that's what Trump and the anti-deep staters complain about, the administrative government which dominates our lives, and yes, it does, and that's another debate on to which extent in the gauge should they be measured as part of our lives. But I would say the analogy is like if you watch Game of Thrones, when the old wise eunuch advised the prince and said he advised him about exercising his power, and power is a shadow on the wall. It's a flicker in the shadows. And what he's saying echoes what Machiavelli said in The Power is a Fleeting Shadow. That Machiavelli said in The Prince that a wise prince should never use his power because it's dangerous. It may threaten to topple him. It certainly could weaken him. A wise prince uses the powers of persuasion and threat. Ultimately, I remember the prince asks Machiavelli, should I be loved or should I be feared? And Machiavelli said, well, ideally you should be universally loved, but that's not possible. So you should be a combination of feared and loved, but never be loathed, despised, because that leads to your downfall. So that therefore comes to the exercise of power. A lot of it in this system that I've just described to you, and the threat of losing privilege benefits. And what other governments don't like is losing economic growth, diminishing their economic wealth. We can see that in tariffs, duties, and sanctions.
So this is also why Trump was such a shakeup of the system, because so many of the things that were basically, even to call them holy grails is maybe an understatement, because they were just so default. That's just the lanes we operate in. NATO, NAFTA, all of these things that basically no one even thought you could even going after China, right? It was just assumed Wall Street and the banks there were just too influential and were making too much kind of money for that relationship. And this guy came in who was never supposed to win and definitely was not part of, I would say, the indoctrined kind of establishment of like, okay, doesn't matter what side of the party you're at, but these are the vectors of the deep state that you should never touch or in any way kind of ruffle.
Yeah, well, when you compare business to deep state, it reminds me of that expression that money isn't true power, belief is power, and who believes the strongest wins. We can see that in Afghanistan and Iraq. The true believers will always prevail.
Yes.
You cannot kill beliefs. Stalin and Mao tried to do that, and one of the beliefs that killed communism was that people truly are individuals and want to have their own life and beliefs and things. You do, I do.
And I think that's also the paradox of what's going on also, like, for instance, between Israel and the Palestinians is, if anything, this is only strengthening Hamas, or at least some of the extreme views that Hamas has ever had, is how do you kill an idea? How do you eradicate an idea?
But you see, deep state doesn't try to do that. That is its strength over communism. You can have whatever beliefs you want. You can worship bananas. We're quite cool with that. But just join this economic system, right? There are benefits for you, man.
Yeah,
and as a government, even if you're an authoritarian government, we don't even need you to be a democracy. Just loosely play according to these trade rules and loosely to human rights. We know you're not going to have our legal system. You can't afford to have all these lawyers.
Yeah.
But in effect, play within this system, and as a government, whatever kind of government you are, you'll survive.
Yeah.
In these authoritarian governments, you have people who've accumulated billions of dollars. And you're at a point where it's not money that's the problem. It's staying alive long enough to enjoy it.
Yeah, if that's even kind of possible, because it's kind of like, it's the tyrant paradox is, how do you exit? And the answer is probably you can never exit, right?
Yes. But yet, if history shows authoritarian and despotic regimes are very survivable. That is, they tend to persist and survive for very long periods.
I mean, look at North Korea, right?
Yeah, look at even Saddam Hussein in Iraq.
Yeah.
That guy was and his family were prospering and enjoying themselves for a long time. And the key to that, having advised quite a number of them during my job and worked in a lot of them on programs, a lot of that has to do with the cohesiveness of their elites.
Exactly. And going back to vol, my understanding, and you'll know this better than me, but most people say that volatility was way lower in Iraq under Saddam Hussein than it is today, right?
Yes, but any government that joins the system, right, the world rules-based trade system has to accept a certain amount of volatility, because not all the trade rules will go your way. And this is what China is basically fighting against in its export-driven growth and recovery strategy. It wants the system to work its way, but yet it doesn't want to honor its WTO commitment. That WTO is not just like you and I say we're going to have a barbecue. It's actually a treaty agreement. You agree to host a barbecue for me every week. I agree to host a lunch for you every day, sort of thing.
And we're supposed to attend, of course. Right.
You're supposed to actually open your markets up, right? It's a commitment. But the current administration in China wants all this in its, I think, dual flow economic model to only work in one way. It's kind of neo-mercantilist in that all the resources come to China at market or lower rates, and China supplies goods to the rest of the world as the reverse benefit, which is different than traditional colonialism, but you don't get to access its market to sell any of your goods. And that's a new version of beggar thy neighbor policy, which a lot of countries has caught up to, because even among its so-called friends in Africa and Latin America, Venezuela and Chile have actually enforced sanctions on certain Chinese goods, because none of those markets can afford to have their local manufacturing.
This is actually a really good point I wanted to touch on, is soft power. So, is another way of thinking about this is colonialism 1.0 was like the original kind of deep state, and colonialism as in the context maybe of previous empires. And this is very hard power focused. And to your point early on, hard power can only extend so far, and it can only be sustained for so long, right? Because it's very resource intensive. Whereas in
That's
one
right.
sense,
It's very hard power,
yeah,
straight up warring and military
yeah,
conflict.
kinetic conflict,
Yeah,
like direct physical,
yeah.
right?
It's
Yeah.
wealth destroying,
Yeah.
and all governments want to be wealth building.
Because again, you survive longer, there's more to go around, your influence increases, so on and so forth. And Deep State 2.0, again, after World War II, is this much more emphasis on soft power, right? And the join the synthetic sovereign kind of nation, or at least the mercantile kind of network, and there's perks and there's kind of benefits.
So it's more than just hard power. It divides power up into numerous levels, being defined as political, technological, economic, financial, trade, right? It divides it up into numerous levels. So you end up playing, let's say, 4D or 5D chess.
Yeah, I mean, and listen, maybe I'm simplifying it too much by having these two camps of hard power and soft power, and hard power being kinetic, because, you could make a very valid argument that, if someone's cutting off your tariffs to like something that's responsible for 80% of your GDP, then that's not soft power, right? That's actually coming for your throat, so to speak. But just on this kind of point, we have predominantly been focusing on the deep state, given an overview, and I guess also really talking about it as in being top down from the US, so Pax Americana, right, to the rest of the world, at least from a global agenda basis. Are there other deep states that represent different ecosystems or different powers of the world that you've come across?
Well, yes, every government itself in every country is a version of its own deep state, because you need to function. You need administrative bureaucracy to make day-to-day decisions, to implement policy, to develop policy, which certainly would be very inefficient and ghastly slow. If you took a poll and you took a democratic vote on it, absolutely every day-to-day function of government, it's just not practical. A lot of people don't understand how vast and deep the deep state is. I mean, during my time in Washington, the World Bank Group was the second largest employer in Washington, D.C., with over 50,000 employees.
Wow.
Being the second largest employer to the U.S. federal government is no small data point.
Yeah.
And U.S. federal government is a huge bureaucracy. So even though they claim to have politicians claim to try to bring less government to your life, it's massive. From the post office to your tax collectors to people who do studies. I think most people in private sector, especially finance, don't understand that they sit on top of a vast lake that is supported by deep state and institutions that allow this water to flow. And you were talking earlier about vol, and the institution, let's say in the U.S., like the Treasury and the SEC and the FDIC, are strong enough to support volatility, that they allow this vol to happen, which is vol is basically saying you take your chances out in the markets. It's not stopping. We're not freezing it.
We're not backstopping it. We're not rescuing anyone.
We're not going to come into, we're not going to like trying to dump in federal money on any predictable basis, except for a huge crisis like the financial crisis in 2008. Which was a very exceptional situation. And even then, you could see, if you read the accounts of it, they're basically consistent with my experience in deep state. The senior political appointees, the U.S. Secretary of Treasury at that time,
Paulson,
was originally formed TARP as a trading platform. Now, you see, Paulson, an ex-investment banker.
Yeah, and he was the CEO of Goldman, right?
And the instincts of an investment banker. This is one of the disadvantages of appointing an investment banker or to these posts instead of a lifelong bureaucrat, is that in a public crisis like 2008, where you have a massive drain of liquidity because everyone's sidelines, right? Institutions, everybody in the T-bill market sidelines. There's no more liquidity anymore. His instinct as a banker is to trade your way out of it. Something I've seen in the crypto market. Young people, inexperienced people, act just like investment bankers, institutional traders. I'm going to trade my way out of this position.
I love that quote. Inexperienced people act like investment bankers. That's great. Yeah.
Your instinct is that you depend on this open market. You don't understand what's wrong underneath it. What are the unique solutions to solve that? So they expect to trade their way out of it. But the problem is you can't trade your way out of it if you don't know what it is. You don't know how big the problem is, and you don't have any liquidity. So setting up a platform, as you've seen, and people out there seeing crypto, is useless. No one wants to use this crypto, right? You are basically stuck in a situation which gets worse until it cripples the entire economy, and you end up with a dark ages situation where I don't want to give you $1 for food. I need to trade water. So you don't want to go down that slippery road. Or if you think that's too extreme, the economic case for that would be the Great Depression of the United States in the 1930s, where the banks said, well, let the other banks fail. And then these other banks, which a lot were smaller Midwest banks, let the farms fail, right? I'm not going to lend money for the farmers to go harvest their crops. Let the crops fail, right? In that case, you end up with what is the Great Depression, a complete market failure that debilitated the entire economy and threatened a way of life. Because communism got its rise through that, right, in the United States, through the Great Depression, with communist leaders saying, look at what your capitalist leaders have done to you, and look how well J.P. Morgan and Vanderbilt are living. They're laughing. Yeah. So that's the road they didn't want to go down. But in effect, the bureaucrats in the Fed and the U.S. Treasury, lowly officers, people you'll never hear of, said, according to our reports, we're grinding to a halt in the T-bill market. There's no more liquidity in this market. And second of all, we've done a study, and even if you form a platform, we don't know how much capital is needed to ignite this platform. What you're trying to do is trying to determine how many basketballs does it take to fill the Pacific Ocean. You don't know. So the only thing we know is that we have a certain number of banks here, right? SIFI banks, systematically influential financial institutions, some of which are doing worse than others, such as Bear Stearns, Merrill Lynch. We can resolve those, but what you need is to force capital into the system through them. The system needs to get a kickstart and needs to know that oil and gas in the engine is flowing. And that was a starting point, you see. But when I say, the reason I give this analogy to you is not to talk about the great financial crisis, was to say that you have a set of quasi-independent institutions like the Treasury, like the Fed, run by bureaucrats who have lifetime employment, who think independently, who are willing to tell the political leadership.
And who are not elected, generally speaking, right?
Who are willing to go to the political leadership, White House and Senate and Congress, and say, we don't care what your views are because we really know what's going on, and you should trust us, and we don't endorse your plan, we endorse our plan, and here are the reasons why. That's why you saw a relatively rapid recovery and resolution. Resolution means resolving debt, right?
Yeah.
And in a financial crisis, it's much like the real estate crisis, a real estate crash, which President Trump knows well about. Well, how do you become a great big economy and real estate tycoon? Okay, well, through debt, right? How do you become a broke real estate tycoon and economy? Through debt. How do you recover a broke economy and a bankrupt real estate organization? Through more debt.
Yeah.
Liquidity, which is debt. And another discussion, we'll go through this. We'll go through what Deep State thinks the concept of money is. But that is what you need injected in the system. On the other hand, with that debt, you need a lot of discipline. And that's what China is facing now, and that you don't have truly independent institutions. From what I read, the bureaucrats at PBOC are much more independent than they were 30 years ago. But nonetheless, they don't control levers of power, administrative bureaucratic power, that let's say the Fed and the U.S. Treasury do.
Yeah,
Therefore, China's recovery off its real estate crisis is going slowly and painfully. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I think like the China thing, and maybe that's a whole nother topic, or we can even cover a segment here and then just take it out, right, as a standalone.
Well, we can do a standalone because it's large enough. But whatever you go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's all good. I mean, again, there's cadences to this. I think the thing about the topics you and I get fascinated about is they're complex adaptive systems. It's rarely we'll cover something and then that's that. But with China, there's a piece I want to put out that's not going to be very kind of in depth, but it's basically going to be called China WTF, like what the fuck. And by that I mean, on the one hand, the market's been waiting for some form of liquidity, recapitalization, haircuts, etc. for years, by the way. This is not something that's just been 3 or 6 months. They finally seem to shake and bake. It actually happened when I was down in Hong Kong and you and I kind of caught up. The main kind of issue goes back to, again, what you're saying. Liquidity is irrelevant if you're supplying it with one hand and with the other hand, you're cutting your throat, right? Whether that is conducting the biggest ever military exercises out of Taiwan, or even, to me, more simplistically, so let's say you and I are entrepreneurs in China. And all of a sudden there's all this liquidity. There's zero incentive for us to go out there, build successful businesses and make money because you're a target. So they've completely killed or stifled, if you want to be generous, right, the entrepreneurial spirit of the Chinese builder. And as you and I both know, I mean, you obviously done way more economics than I have, all the job creation, all the real GDP growth comes from SMEs, right? It doesn't come from the SOEs, the sovereign, entities. It doesn't come from large cap companies. Actually, it comes from SMEs. And there's no benefit from everything I can read and see. And of course, it's a big place, so I'm sure there's exceptions to it. It's a large country. It's 1.4 billion people. When you're dealing with anything like that, there's always a few pockets of both sides of the tail. But from everything I can see from Xi, it's very, very clear that tech and entrepreneurship has been killed. And any kind of Elon Musks of this generation or the next generation who are coming out of China, it's just not going to happen. I think that's kind of the main structural issue I have with seeing them trying to do all of this liquidity when we have no structural reform from a fiscal perspective. And I think even more just the zeitgeist of the current times. And I don't know what you feel about that. You're obviously up North Asia. You're much closer. You have more ties. So I'd be interested to see how you think of it.
Well, I had an argument the other day with a pro-China family office who said, look, capitalism isn't dead in China. And no one said it was dead, but you have to understand that capitalism, in the face of an authoritarian government that seeks to interpret it in a very dictatorial central government way, is very vulnerable.
Exactly.
Capitalism is a very vulnerable system in the face of government onslaught. One has to be very careful even how you regulate it. And in China's case, they think the power and benefits of capitalism have to be highly centralized within government entities or entities under its control. And that's a very risky concept.
That's like akin to say you want the plane to take off, but the wings have to stay on the ground or something like that.
Like that's what I hear, right? When you break it down that way. It's like, okay, I hear you in theory, but in practice, that's not how it works. That's the whole point of capitalism, right?
I mean, unpacked a number of issues
Yeah.
which have to be addressed vis-a-vis capitalism and China's new version of capitalism with Chinese characteristics. And one of those versions is that every country and society interprets capitalism differently. So
Agree.
There's that allowance for
very different from the US.
whether you allow predatory capitalism or communitarian capitalism, which is what it's like in Europe. However, in China's case, it wants all the upsides of capitalism and doesn't want to deal with the downsides. And the downsides including, what you bring up earlier, which is vol, right?
Yes.
Vol, it means you could lose, and you will probably have periods where you do lose, right?
And 100%. And again, sorry to interject, but just so I don't lose this thought stream, like this is why, like China to me is just for lack of a better word, and we say in China, we're of course talking about the leadership, and even here, probably just a very small clip of that leadership. I appreciated what you said. A government exists, first and foremost, it needs to be a going concern. And that has never been more true than China, where you could disagree on a lot of things, but you could say the number one thing that the PCC has is social stability, just given the scale of the people in the country. It's not like Palestine, where Hamas could basically control and bully 2 million people. This is 1.4 billion or 1.3 or whatever it is. After a certain tipping point of protests on the street, there's no return. So social stability has been, at least from my understanding, the number one kind of calling card. But to me, the path that they've undertaken is actually going to accelerate towards the point of no return on social stability, right? It's just a question of time, which, granted, as we said early on, can last way, way longer than you think, right? This is not like a 1 year or 2 year prediction. This could be kind of decades in kind of the making. It just seems so self-inflicted. It reminds me of Erdogan in Turkey, right? I'm not trying to say it's easy, but it's simple. Just make it okay to be an entrepreneur again, to be a capitalist again. I think we're not talking about like it has to be the Western model, which we also know has its own levels of flaws. I saw a very interesting, interview with Mark Andreessen from A16Z, and he was basically saying, even if you look at the US, probably the only place where you see real capitalism is in the Valley. And as soon as you kind of get into that, you see a lot of, protective kind of rackets, because it's like, okay, you're an insurer, I'm an insurer, I can only be an insurer in my state, I can't come into your state until, whatever kind of barriers are kind of caught. So it's more like really crony capitalism from a net basis. But it just so happens that there's so much more value that's still being created from the part that's quote unquote, much more kind of pure to the capitalist side than to the other. But I also think that, people also just give too much credit to capitalism and democracy in the US. And when you actually look under the overall kind of surface, there's things that are much more, let's say, commonplace to other parts of the world, right? Including the third and kind of fourth world, so to speak. But just going back on China, do you agree with that? I mean, how sustainable is this path? Because I get it from a Xi party control. You are concerned that, okay, these people are making a lot of money. That means they're going to increase their level of influence. And of course, we saw this really, really shown very well with Jack Ma, who reminded me of Khodorkovsky back from the Russia days, if you recall. Someone who maybe forgot what area and what environment they were operating in and had to be put in kind of place. But I think it's one thing to, let's say, be put in place if you're too vocal or too loud. I think it's a whole different other thing when you're basically, killing entire kind of generations' potential for growth and innovation and setting the bell curve, not just for China, but also for the rest of the world and for the betterment of humanity. Well, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but how is this sustain? How does this not implode? I guess I'm trying to ask.
Well, let's start with your points on China. I think China can sustain its current course without any substantial systemic reform that what a lot of foreign analysts have called for, as long as the people are willing to put up with the economic suffering.
Yeah. And let's just be clear, they can do a lot of systematic reform that's internal. It doesn't even have to be external facing. It doesn't have to pander to Washington or to Europe or whatever. So I'm just kind of talking about from the efficiency. They'll be happier than me to have two global powers, because I think that actually net tends to make the world a better and more diverse place. There's more optionality than if it's just one kind of game in town.
If you exclude the external forces, as they call it, and I've read a lot of the up-to-date literature from mainland academics, bureaucrats, and institutions on the purpose of this whole exercise that they're doing. It will continue and be sustained as long as the people are willing to put up with the economic suffering. And I make that point because this exercise is not just a fiscal or monetary policy. It is a moral, spiritual purification, much like the other campaigns that China has endured that has created its degree of suffering, whether it be Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution. These are internally government-generated, their deep state-generated movements in order to purify the people, because according to what I've read, the leadership thinks capitalism has gone too far in China. People are too interested in golf club memberships and luxury goods, and they need to return to their nationalist, to their cultural roots. And this is a purge, an ongoing purge, in which to do so. The only problem I explain to Western analysts is that if you look at Communist Party history, such as events such as the Long March and the Great Leap Forward, and if you read Orwell, the purpose of these purges is not any real tangible economic outcome. The purpose of the purge is the purge itself. Power, as Orwell said, the purpose of power is to sustain power itself. There's no outcome at the end, like with TARP, where in the United States, where it ended, or where these programs end. Now we move on to the next program. We've accomplished tangible economic, fiscal, monetary goals. No, there is not. It's an ongoing, it's like being a member of a cult or a religion. It's ongoing. You never do achieve nirvana. You never do.
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely not coming back from the printing press.
You never do achieve heaven on earth. Okay?
Yeah.
So this is what analysts miss. The program doesn't. The program never ends, and I think if. Go ahead. You had a point.
Yeah. No, so I guess there's a few things, right? And separately, I'd love to just get your Western analyst take versus Eastern analyst take. So what do a lot of the Western kind of analysts maybe, let's say, miss, apart from just a naivete that, hey, there's different systems, there's different cultures across the world, which sounds very simplistic to you and I, but it's still very stunning to me when I meet my European and American cousins, right, who've not done too much traveling, and just how much they are operating from their inbox. But I'd just be curious at what is maybe often missed. So that's just one side question you can kind of marinate on. But I guess it kind of all goes back to where I feel that I am maybe naive, saying I don't get where this is all going. But of course, I'm saying China, what the fuck, because I'm assuming that if you're doing all of this stimulus, you're trying to solve for the economy, for the betterment of your people. But what you're pointing out is it actually has nothing to do with that. It has all going back to do with power and maintaining control, or at the very least semblance of that kind of control. So Kenny, it goes back to what I'm trying to say is, before you pass an analysis, judgment, or at least a thesis on something, you need to kind of draw the assumption on what do you think is being optimized for before you read too much into kind of the actions.
And it's being optimized, which is an ongoing process. As I said, there's no end in it. For spiritual purification, to rid your soul and psyche of the impurifications brought on by Western capitalism.
But is that really true, or is that just a tagline for them to get more control, get more resources?
Well, the only way you can do to accomplish this process and to do it successfully is through power. It's all just a cycle that is self-reinforcing. I need more power to do this, then I do this, and then I implement more of it on you in order to get more power.
Yeah.
Like there's no end game. Power exists, and this is true for any government. Power exists not as a means to an end, but as an end in itself. Because as a government, I don't worry about, unlike corporate, profit and loss.
Yeah.
I will prevail no matter what. And the most extreme end is, I meet a lot of, just like you do, rich people who think money can buy anything.
Mm-hmm.
But take it to another level. If I have power, I can take anything.
Yeah.
How does that sound?
Yeah. The money you have is no longer money. And actually, I think COVID was a good mark to market on some of these people who thought they were basically untouchable. And all of a sudden they found out, okay, they could get on the jet, but they literally weren't allowed to land in places. But I hear you on all of that, I guess it's super fascinating to me because it's almost like we're watching, a movie, and perhaps I was super naive years back expecting a lot out of Xi and where China kind of was potentially kind of going. I suppose to me it just seems false. What's the expression? There's a move in chess. The team will dig it out. But in essence, it's whatever move you do next is just terrible and you have no other kind of choice. So like I almost feel like you've already failed before you've kind of taken off. And to me, it's like, yes, you can do this power and you can attempt to make these cultural changes. And perhaps they'll be correct and after a while it'll go through. But I think the delta is small. But the reason I say that is it's because it's not like the Chinese people have not been traveling. It's not like they don't have VPNs. It's not like they've not been educated abroad, right? This is very, very different from North Korea. And for people who don't know, North Korea, the indoctrination literally starts in grade school, right? So they're brought up from the start, like completely indoctrined with their leader pretty much being a god, values to live by, tattletale, to put it very lightly, on your neighbor and watching others. Like that's complete kind of brainwashing. I'm not trying to say that no society has elements of this in their education and kind of in their culture. Of course, it's all about belief in the flag and belief in the sovereign kind of borders of wherever it is you kind of hail from. It just seems like one painful exercise that's not going to end well. But perhaps I'm completely missing something.
I think when I talk to Western analysts,
yes,
the first point I take up with them is, well, really not whether or not that this current exercise in China will or will not end well. I think that's really
and that probably needs some definition
as well. And well for who?
And well for who? And you have to understand that leaders of his generation, like Xi, are very attuned to actually what the population's needs are. My point here is that they know that this current generation is still capable of a mass calling, a mass rally to the party's cause. They believe there's still that instinct. And the key factors that they have to sustain in order to keep this policy rolling is, one, being able to feed their people, which they weren't in the past. And in the past, they've had huge famines in China, resulting in the death of tens of millions. They're able to do that. So their priority is that whole agricultural economy and the ability to import enough food. And they're a large import. So the ability to feed people, to house them, which despite a property crisis, they've managed to take care of, and the ability to educate and provide basic social welfare services, which they have been able to do, although in China, broadly speaking, social welfare is a much lower percent of domestic GDP than other developed countries.
Yeah.
So he's operating under this fulcrum of stability, which he has defined, and to be honest, I believe he closely understands, because he's the domestic leader. Now let's get to foreign investors, because we're trying to unpack a few different constituencies.
Yeah.
I tell foreign investors, you have to, as a trader, banker, analyst, sometimes you have to come to grips with and get real with the fact that you and your counterparty, China, or the market system or economic system that you are referring to, have completely changed on you. Not just cyclically, but maybe not even secular. Apples and oranges, right? Just because China now has modernized and uses Western economic metrics such as GDP, M1, M2, velocity of capital, all the credit terminologies that Western economists use, doesn't mean that they will prescribe traditional Keynesian Western-style economic policies and solutions to those data points and outcomes, which is what you're seeing in the current crisis. They will not take those systemic reforms because it devolves power away from central government. And because of that, the one statement that all these analysts refuse, and I think you and I have talked about that, refuse to discuss because it endangers their job, is that the system has completely changed, and you are analyzing the wrong system. No matter how much you analyze it, if they do not adopt Western policy prescriptions, which are instinctive to market economics, you have a problem. Up to now, we've been playing with euphemisms, capitalism with Chinese characteristics. That only really worked when we had great IPOs and the market kept going and going, and we all need money. But you and I know markets reverse on you, and there are strategies and tactics, painful as they are, for dealing with them. And in our case, we are not a country, so they'll be forced upon you, right, by your banks, by your investors, to pivot. They refuse to pivot, and it's within their fiat because they control the RMB to do so. But it is coming at large economic costs. But I do tell analysts, you have to face once in your life a huge, magnificent misunderstanding. It's like a really, really bad marriage. My wife really hates it when I load up the dishwasher with the pointy ends of the steak knives sticking up. She really gets upset at that, right? And then I really get upset when she tells me she wants to have sex with other men. You understand it? It's like an untenable situation where you're so far apart on every issue, minor and major, that you have to realize you're going to have to take a different path here. Now that's easy to say if you're North Korea, Somalia, Sudan, your countries that aren't significant to the world trade and economics and the logistics system.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, China is. And it's going to take a while to restructure that to suit a situation and country that does not want to join the rules-based global system as defined by the United States, if you want to be blunt.
Yeah, of course, because they feel like they're being talked down to rather than being met as a peer, I'm assuming.
But yet China wants to be central to this system. This is the definition problem that China has. I want to be central, but I don't want to be the superpower. I want influence, I want right of refusal, and want to have say in everything, but I don't want to run the thing. In effect, it wants power without responsibility. And since the discussion today is about power, it comes with great responsibility.
Yeah. And just on this point, so I've been very fascinated by the soft power elements, which I kind of describe as influence and brand, right, in different ways. So it's not military, it's not missiles, it's not boots on the ground, it's not threats, but it's like, I think we've seen some phenomenal soft power out of the likes of Saudi, right? They did the golfing thing. We've seen great soft power out of the UAE, Emirates. I would even say Singapore in its kind of birth and inception and structure of like Changi, Singapore Airlines, and Lee Kuan Yew really kind of understood that you have to make it as easy as possible for people to come and they should be blown away in that entry. You're taking out the friction, right? Just as an example. And the thing that I just can't get over is, at least from everything I can see, how poor the soft power plays from China have been, if really anything kind of at all. The whole Silk Road seemed phenomenal in scope and vision, but executed very, very kind of bluntly. We also have to take a lot of this stuff with a grain of salt, because most of the coverage of China, 80 to 90%, has a Western bias, right? So they could walk on water and people would argue and make the observation that they can't swim. That's why they're walking on water kind of thing. But like, why is there no more or better concentration and focus on China using soft power across the world? Like, to me, it seems like such an asymmetrical trade for them in regards to what they'd have to put from an outlay compared to what they could kind of get back from an influence. Or am I totally missing that? Are there some great examples you've kind of come across? Is it just because, again, there's so many issues domestically? Or is it just like historically that's just how they've been, very kind of inward, really looking?
To return to our starting point in this discussion, to answer your question and issue, I always wondered for years how China made this sudden turn. And A lot of people, a lot of your media out there would say this is President Xi's policy. But as someone who'd worked in deep state and who has worked with the World Bank in China, I've dealt with a lot of bureaucrats at a level that businessmen and bankers would never even see, because you are part of a government. You're part of an international government organization. And I always wondered how she could have done this without strong bureaucratic support. As a matter of fact, I asserted to myself the bureaucracy must have lent and developed a platform for him. But I'd long left the bank. We recently met with a diplomat from a consul general from Southeast Asian country. I won't mention where because he's currently serving. I said, hey, he was based in Washington. We had a lot of mutual friends, and then he was based in Beijing for a number of years in the late 2000s. I asked him, what's going on here? Did you, in your dealing at the bureaucratic level, what did you hear about this change? And he said, in his meetings and social gatherings with Beijing bureaucrats, he'd gotten told literally this message, which was, this is post-2008 financial crisis. He was told, you better tell your country that it should stop being so neutral, and it's going to have to choose sides, because we're going to go on our own. We're not going to be partners with the U.S. anymore. We're not going to be partners of this system. And the reason was that a lot of the bureaucracy in Beijing was very disappointed. And this person he spoke to was a very high-ranking bureaucrat. I can't remember the name, but he and his colleagues were very disappointed at the U.S. reaction and prescriptions to the financial crisis, that everybody had to pay the bill. It was like you had a party at one of your beach homes and it burnt down, and you send me the invoice saying, "Oh, you got to share in this bill."
Got it. So
and they were saying you guys were having a big debt party in the U.S.
Why are we paying for this?
Yeah, according to these movies coming and documentaries coming, and now you're sticking us with the bill. Why should we pay? And they didn't like that medicine. That prescription.
So this is going back to the GFC, right? When China printed 14% of their GDP, in essence.
Yes, we did you a big favor, and now you're back to trying to coerce us and forcing open our market when we don't think they're ready. Where's our payback for this? Where's our respect? That's basically it. So the bureaucracy, long years before she came to power in, I believe, 2013, were already fomenting and concurring on this idea, on this plan, on this major move. And it coincided with what she felt in terms of the spiritual corruption of China underneath this system. And it's time China made its move. It decided to settle all family business right now and then, even though I don't think it has that kind of clout yet, and that's what's creating a lot of problems. But that was the ground zero, I think. The bureaucracy, their deep state, saying, we're mad as hell, we're not going to take it anymore. No, if this is what rules-based system is, these rules don't work for us. And this is a clear example of why they truly work against us. So that was the seed, the germ for today's current policy. She's not the only one. They say that in the media. He is not the only person driving this. It can't be in an economy that large.
No, I mean, I completely agree. And I think also a lot of people forget, again, to your point, and also historically, there are some powerful families in China, right? With probably more power than most presidents in big countries around the world.
Yeah, correct. He is minimalizing that. And that action on Alibaba was part of that move, because some of these families are involved in that.
But I'm sure he must also have some families that support him. I don't think he can operate as an independent, right? Or what do you feel?
I don't think so. I think many of those families actually, because now they are part of the wealth bourgeois class that Marx talked about, I think they're on the other side of the table. But, I believe she has the party and all its security levers and economic levers under control. So that's why he's pushing a very large economic and wealth transformation in China. He doesn't want the emergence of power centers and warlords. He wants to truly cleanse the direction of the country and to end the corruption at all levels. And this is the long march that you must take to do so. It's painful. It's going to be to deprive you of many materialistic pleasures.
Listen, like, and this is holistically, and maybe we can just wrap up the section on kind of China and go back kind of from a proverbial 100,000 kind of view. Like, I could see some of the philosophy, right? Because I'm assuming if I was potentially the leadership in China and I was one of the older kind of generations, you're extrapolating out and you're also seeing what's happening in the US, right? And you're thinking, wow, we don't want to end up like this, where it's really kind of a tale of two cities, those with assets and those without, and they're living very different lives in the good old US of A. There's a big difference between me and you being Silicon Valley tech elites or New York bankers, and of course being in the Midwest potentially, right? And I can kind of get that. I'm just not quite sure if this is kind of the right path. And for the record, I'm not even sure that a civilized society is one where you and I need to go and get debt to study and basically live a life of almost kind of master kind of slave from a framework kind of perspective. I actually think that's not necessarily a civil society in my world, but that's maybe a topic for a different kind of conversation.
Yeah, capitalism, and Marx was right about the potential evils and the end game of capitalism, which is concentration of wealth and power, oppression of your average person. No doubt about that. That's why capitalism requires regulation. What and how much that is a matter of political debate, and you need a system that's able to accommodate a range of regulatory posture and policy. But that is how a socially liberal, democratic civil society operates. There's a constant debate, and I think maybe perhaps the U.S. has now developed an extreme polarized sense of debate, but any government and country with strong institutions should easily weather it, which I think the U.S. is. Life continues on a day-to-day basis. Maybe there's more inflation today than there was yesterday, but that's not the first time the country has faced that. But nonetheless, it's not debilitated.
So this is set in a very kind of deep state kind of framework where you're looking at the average, but you're not necessarily looking at the makeup of the average. But again, I get that top down kind of command and kind of taking it back to the overall kind of topic here from a deep state perspective.
So to go back to directly address your China perspective.
Yeah.
I think in China, a lot of your academics, your bureaucrats are fairly isolated. And they cannot discern, and this is what you have to discern, going back to the issue I said about how market analysts and bankers have to really discern that their system's completely changed, right? It's very easy for someone to be lost in between perspective and perception. The perception you have is easily manipulated, but you have to gain perspective from different viewpoints of what is really happening and what are the underpinnings, the foundations that are keeping a society going. Do they exist at all? And if they exist, what are they? Because that is what really defines and elaborates on whether this system will survive.
Okay. So you'd mentioned something earlier as a little bit of a teaser that I'd love to unpack, and then maybe we can kind of head towards kind of the tail end of at least this first cut on a primer on the deep state. The concept of money. How does the deep state think about that? Because you mentioned it's potentially very different from maybe how most people would, right?
Well, that's an entirely different discussion, but we can kind of use this as a preview to it.
Sure.
Money isn't real. It's a concept. What's real is the life you have, which is you can buy food, you can go out and buy your material goods, take care of yourself, your family. That's real. Money is just a means to achieve that, compared to the Dark Ages when fiat currency failed and hence all economies failed. You basically had a system of barter.
Yeah.
Ultimately, the way barter fails is that you end up with a system of, well, I just need water, guns, and ammunition, because with the guns and ammunition, I can take everything else when I need it. And this kind of Mad Max situation, no one wants, because civil government, liberal democratic civil societies are very difficult to form. I mean, look how many 100 years it took in Europe of wars and slaughter to finally get to managing their affairs via the EU.
Yeah.
So my point is, if money is just a concept, a construct, then all money is dead.
Got it. So that means metrics about spending, debt, these are kind of irrelevant in the broader scope of how the deep state thinks. Because at the end of the day, money is just a conduit.
Yeah, and to apply moral concepts to money.
Yeah.
Like the Austrian economist did, saying that overspending is a sign of economic, moral profligacy and degeneracy, is utterly wrong. That's why I think the U.S. national deficits are relatively easy to handle. Based on my training and experience, I see it from a totally different point of view. Don't worry about it, because without it, your life may be more morally pleasing and upright, but the rest of your life is going to be terrible.
So one thing that I think is very hard to do, right, is it's very easy to criticize elements of the government. It's very easy to also criticize, let's say, the deep state and the fact that even deep state, unknown, behind the shadows, it's always like, okay, it's got to be completely evil and taken out. But what's of course very hard to see is what would the world be in today if we didn't have the Pax Americana and this deep state that, for all intents and purposes, the controlling seat, the Iron Throne has been held by the U.S., right? And potentially still is going to be held by the U.S. for quite a while longer to come. Right?
I guess a good way to round off and finish off the discussion really is something I tell people that super triggers them, super upsets people, in that the Pax Americana, the American-based, rules-based system, has done outstandingly well for everyone in the world, even those in poverty and famine. As I have certainly worked in a lot of famine and stricken and impoverished countries with direct experience, unlike most people, and I can tell you it's improved tremendously from post-war, post-1970, and in any metric you take. So, and with the average people in most countries, with the credit card you look at, and all the platforms for crypto and virtual finance, we have a cornucopia of choice and luxury in this world. So I say to everybody, I know for whatever reasons you're morally indignant upon this dominance. It's not a bad deal. You ought to take it.
One last thing from my side, Mr. IamDeepState. You did mention like it was 1.0 pre-World War II. We got to 2.0 post-World War II. What do you think is the next cut? What is Deep State 3.0? And maybe I'll also caveat that with saying that I think a lot of the things that the Deep State was doing was you needed that admin operation side that kind of transcends whatever leadership is changing, right? At least to a certain kind of extent. But also with the birth of AI, a lot of what I kind of think of as the third kind of party industries that you'd need for A and B to kind of do a transaction or do some kind of agreement are going to becoming less and less kind of relevant. Like if you had to just extrapolate, and we could do a longer segment on this in the future, maybe when you've had a bit more time to think about it. But what is the Deep State 3.0 down the line? What's that looking like?
I think Deep State 3.0 will have to deal with two things. On the tech side, it will have to deal with AI. But I have every confidence governments, all deep states, will get in control of AI just like they got in control of the internet, of chat rooms, of messaging services. It's a matter of survival. And just as no government would allow a parallel currency to operate in their system, no government will allow a parallel force like AI to completely dominate their system. Second one is an economic one, which is the force of deglobalization, which is what you see occurring now. We can do a separate segment on what are the forces driving that, and who wins and who loses in that. Just a hint and as a preview for the next one, the U.S. empire won't lose on that one either. Now, we'll explain why in the next episode.
Fantastic. Well, IamDeepState, thank you for joining, as always, and looking forward to the next jam. Appreciate you, my man.
Okay, thank you. Talk to you later.